Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Russell here and I'm doing your lesson for this week. So as you can see, we're going to be analysing fiction. We've been alternating the lessons for you from a writing to a reading one each week just to keep it a little bit fresh. So for your reading, you've already done the poetry response with Mrs. Brockman-Smith. You've done a non-fiction response with Mr. Smith, and now we're looking at some fiction. So today during this lesson, we're going to be looking at an opening of a novel to then examine. We're going to look at the question that goes with it, pull it apart and think about what our response might be to that question. And then to respond to that, we need to examine the writer's use of language and what it might suggest. So the similar skills that we're still building up as that you've done before. Okay, so you might think, oh my God, here we go again, but it's really important that we're really embedding this skill of analysing. For you higher students, it's really important that you're ensuring that you always analyse. So we need to be examining these texts methodically and in detail, so you can then explain and interpret it in your responses to show how deeply you can consider a piece of writing. Today we're going to be looking at the opening of this book, The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. Just popped a little front cover on there to jazz up the PowerPoint, but also if you find the opening interesting and think you might like to have a little bit of a read, because we haven't got much else to do at the moment, then there's the cover for you so you know what you're looking for. So the question we're looking at is, how does Gaiman create an atmosphere in the opening of his novel, The Graveyard Book? Now this question is quite broad at this point. It's not telling us what atmosphere is being created, it's allowing us as a reader to decide that and look for it when we look at our opening of the novel. So this will be really familiar to you. If we were in class right now, we would have this up on the screen. You'd be writing it down in your book and you'd be jotting your ideas around it. I'd be asking you to tell me what the keywords are in the question, but unfortunately we're going to have to listen to me a bit more, talk about what I think are the keywords and why. If you're writing your exercise books or on paper now, this will be on the screen for a little bit and you can jot some of the ideas around as well. So first of all, I've picked out what I think is one of the most important words in these types of questions, and it always comes up, and it's the word how. Now this is telling you to think about the words, the techniques and the structure that the writer is using. The writer is deliberately using different devices, and we need to be able to recognise them and to discuss them, because this then tells us how the atmosphere is created, and it means that that's sort of leading us to the analysis. We then got the writer's name written down, and it links really to this word create. We need to remember that this is not real, it's made up. It's a crafted piece of writing by Neil Gaiman. Just like you guys last week were writing your own story openings, you were deliberately, hopefully, choosing words, structures, techniques to create certain effects and to make your reader feel something. And this is the same thing. We need to think about how this writer is creating. This then takes us to this word atmosphere. Now we're not talking about the atmosphere up in space, we're talking about the mood or feelings that are being created. So just the same as like if you walk into a room after there's been an argument, you can often feel that atmosphere. The writer's trying to do the same. They're trying to make you feel something when they write and create an atmosphere in their writing. And I thought it might be interesting just to look at the title of the book. This is something we do more so when we look at poetry, because we can analyse the titles. But for us, when we're first starting to think about what this question is asking us and what to expect when we read this extract, the fact this novel is called The Graveyard Book is kind of giving us some clues about what kind of atmosphere you might expect to see in a book with this kind of title. Okay, so for you guys, as I read the extract and once we start to pull it apart afterwards, it's really good for you to keep focused on this how, okay? we're looking at the language, so it's the vocabulary choices that the writer is making. They are deliberately choosing certain words over other ones to have an effect on us. So that's the first thing we need to be thinking about. The next one is techniques. So we've done lots on techniques last week because you were writing your own story opening. So you may have thought to use similes or metaphors or personification or the use of prophetic fallacy because you thought that might create a certain mood. And you're trying to match your techniques, and the same with your language, with the mood that you're wanting to create. So it would be great if you can see any of that within the piece of writing. Not all techniques, though, are always going to be used in all bits of writing. So it mustn't be that you've just got a tick list and you're trying to hunt for them, but as you practice analysing extracts and pulling them apart, these different techniques will be more easily spotted by you. And then this third one is the one that I think students often find harder, or if they do spot them, they then find them hard to write about and hard to explain what the effects are of these. But we're thinking with structure of the form, so how it's been laid out, and also how the writer's been organising their ideas. So if they've done a one-lined paragraph, why? And sometimes you might not be able to think of a reason, and if you haven't got anything to say about it, then it may just be time to leave it. But often you can spot things that the writer's doing and how that might be conveying an atmosphere or a mood or a moment or a character's feelings. And some of those I'll try and draw your attention to as we look at the extract. Okay guys, so if you would rather just read this to yourself, then, mute me whilst it's on the screen. But sometimes it's just nice to have it read out to you. In the exam you won't be able to read aloud, but in the classroom I'd read this out to you as you went through and highlighted. Now, if you've got the ability to print it off, that's brilliant. If not, you can just do it on screen when we get to the next bit. So first of all, we'll just read it through, we'll enjoy it for the story, but have in the back of your mind about the atmosphere that's being created. What do you feel, or what mood do you get? Now, some of you might not get anything, but what you need to do, if you're not really affected by bits of writing, then you need to train yourself to think, what do I think the writer is trying to do? What effect do I think they're trying to create? There was a hand in the darkness, and it held a knife. The knife has a handle of polished black bone, and a blade finer and sharper than any razor. If it sliced you, you might not even know you had been cut, not immediately. The knife had done almost everything it was brought to the house to do, and both the blade and the handle were wet. The street door was still open, just a little, where the knife and the man who held it had slipped in, and wisps of nighttime mist slivered and twined into the house through the door. The man Jack paused on the landing. With his left hand he pulled a large white handkerchief from the pocket of his black coat, and with it wiped off the knife and his gloved right hand which had been holding it. Then he put the handkerchief away. The hunt was almost over. He had left the woman in her bed, the man on the bedroom floor, the older child in her brightly covered bedroom, surrounded by toys and half-finished models. That only left the little one, a baby, barely a toddler, to take care of. One more and his task would be done. He flexed his fingers. The man Jack was, above all things, a professional, or so he told himself, and he would not allow himself to smile until the job was completed. His hair was dark, and he wore black leather gloves of the thinnest lambskin. The toddler's room was at the very top of the house. The man Jack walked up the stairs, his feet silent on the carpeting. Then he pushed open the attic door, and he walked in. His shoes were black leather, and they were polished to such a shine that they looked like dark mirrors. You could see the moon reflected in them, tiny and half full. The real moon shone through the casement window. Its light was not bright, and it was diffused by the mist, but the man Jack would not need much light. The moonlight was enough. it would do. He could make out the shape of the child in the cot, head, limbs and torso. The cot had high, slatted sides to prevent the child from getting out. Jack leaned over, raised his right hand, the one holding the knife, and he aimed for the chest. And then he lowered his hand. The shape in the cot was a teddy bear. There was no child. Okay guys, so I've read that through to you once. I'd advise you to do the same in any assessment. And now what I would like you to do is go back through that, and you may have started this already, but go through and then choose any words or phrases that you could pick out that you think answers that question of how the writer is creating atmosphere. Now, obviously you need to think about what atmosphere is being created, and it might be worth jotting that down, a couple of ideas first, and then going through and highlighting. And you might get that there's 2 or 3 different words to describe the atmosphere. So you could say it's a sinister atmosphere, and then find evidence that supports your idea or your point that you think it's a sinister atmosphere. If you can't highlight through because you haven't got it printed out, you can highlight on the screen or change the colours of the text, or just jot them down and make a bullet point list of some of the best quotes. I've put a link on there if you want to do a 5-minute timer, but you can just simply pause the PowerPoint, spend as much time as you want on this bit. We haven't got to do it in really, really strict time conditions, and then we can continue on to the next slide. On the screen, this is one of the parts I did. I've not highlighted loads of ones. In class, we'd sit there and probably end up doing a whole lesson accidentally, where we'd all be putting our suggestions in. You'd be adding notes to your piece of writing. We'd all be putting in our different ideas, and this whole sheet would be full up of ideas and annotations. The one I've picked out for you, and there are loads in here that you could have picked out, so you'll have a multitude to choose from, was this phrase sort of towards the end where it says, its light, it's talking about the moon, its light was not bright, and it was diffused by the mist, but the man Jack would not need much light. Back there, I've started to actually talk about structure because I've talked about the writer's use of repetition. So you don't always have to talk about the writers using short sentences, but that might be relevant for a quote you might look at. Using repetition is a structural device. The writer's repeating that idea of light for a reason. So have a look at one of your quotes, start pulling it apart, just like we would do in class. But always have in your mind, what is the atmosphere being created? How is it being created? Okay guys, hopefully you got on okay with that. And now we've kind of got to this point where we need to be writing it up. Now with you guys, I'm not going to go through P, where we go point, evidence, explain, because you guys should be at this point naturally writing these kind of essay style paragraphs with more confidence. What I will do is just read this one to you, and you can use it as a kind of a guide, a sort of a level to be aiming for with your own. And I'll just talk about a few key things that I've done in this that you might want to consider when you're writing your response. An atmosphere of fading hope is created within the opening of the novel, The Graveyard Book, when the writer takes time to describe the moonlight coming through the window. Its light was not bright, and it was diffused by the mist, but the man Jack would not need much light. These several references to light could be seen as a metaphor for hope or life here. However, the writer repeats the word not, indicating that the light is not needed or that it is barely present, suggesting that it is fading, which creates a sinister atmosphere of fading life and hope. This is reinforced by the verb diffused, meaning weakened or fading, emphasising the threatened life of the child. In addition to this, the writer's use of prophetic fallacy to describe the mist and its ability to fade light strengthens the sinister and mysterious atmosphere here, as the mist could remind the reader of its abilities to hide and disguise, which would be ideal for someone intending to commit a crime. The atmosphere the writer creates in this one sentence encapsulates one of sinister foreshadowing of a terrible crime about to occur. Okay guys, so you'll have seen lots of these types of responses before, but I just want to talk through a couple of things that I've done to remind you to sort of try and incorporate them in your response. So I've made sure that my opening point within this response is really focused on the question. Now, what you mustn't do with this question is just say an atmosphere is created within the opening of the novel, because it's not specific enough. You need to state what atmosphere you believe is being created. The question is deliberately quite broad and open, so you can focus in on what you want to do and what you want to discuss. So that's one thing to think about, and make sure your point is really precise. Another thing to try and do where possible is to blend your evidence in. I think you will be fine with that now, but I don't really want to see people referring to this is shown by the quote. Okay, try and blend it into a sentence so it reads as one full line. Now, another thing that I've tried to do is really show that I'm talking about the writer's language and techniques. So you can see my first line of explanation refers to a metaphor. Now, I talked about the idea of light representing hope for life, and it could be seen as standing for something else or meaning something else. So I've talked about that use of the word metaphor. I've also done it, that's talking about technique, I've also talked about the language when I use things like the word verb. Another technique when I talk about prophetic fallacy. This was a particularly nice quote because there's lots of different things I could talk about. It might not always be the case, but it doesn't mean that the quote you've picked isn't worth discussing. You're going to pick up just as many marks by the detailed analysis that you do and what you've got to say about it. It's just nice that if you were writing several of these paragraphs, some of them you were able to talk about the writer's use of the language or the techniques that they're doing. It's just showing a much higher level skill. Another thing you'll notice I do is I'm always talking about what the writer is doing. Okay, the writer repeats the word, the writer's use of prophetic fallacy. It really demonstrates to the person marking your work that you are really focused on the fact that this is something that's been crafted by the writer, and the writer's made a decision to use these techniques. It's showing a much higher level skill. Also, you'll notice that I often link back to the sinister atmosphere or the mysterious atmosphere. I'm making sure that I'm really focused on that question throughout this response. You can see that there's lots of analysis in there because there's lots of different sections of my quote. If you've chosen a small quote, you can still say lots about a little, and as long as you're really explaining your ideas in depth, that's brilliant. Another thing that I've done that you should try and do is think about the reader. So you'll notice I've put the mist could remind the reader of its abilities. Now, you are the reader and I'm the reader, so I could put the mist reminds me of its abilities. But if you can write in third person and talk about the reader as a whole, that shows you're writing at a little bit of a higher standard, and it's more of an essay style of writing. At the end, I've just tried to summarise what I think the atmosphere has created here, and connect back and sort of summarise what how this writer is creating an atmosphere. So there's just some things there that you might want to pinch or think about when you come to writing your response. Okay, so now, obviously you can finish this PowerPoint and then do it, but I'd like you to have a go at writing up your own ideas. So pick one quote. We only want one paragraph. You don't have to write a full essay at all. Just one paragraph where you're answering that question. Now, you might feel like, oh, I don't know if it's very good, or I'm not very confident with it. If you aren't sure, if you've got a quote but you're not sure if you've got the right ideas about it, then before you even write it, feel free to email one of us, or your teacher, but any of us, I'm sure we'd respond, and ask some questions and say, is this right, am I not the right lines? If that's sort of affecting your confidence, because you would easily be able to do that in class, and it's not so easy at the moment, but we're pretty quick at responding to emails. If you need a little bit of help crafting it before you write your final version up, that's absolutely fine. What you send us doesn't have to be a perfect version, okay? The idea is that we just keep practicing these skills, so they don't fade over time. So when we're back in school, you sort of lost all your confidence. Send us whatever you've got, and we will always send you feedback and suggestions to improve it and tell you what you're nailing and is working really well.
Okay, so once you've written your paragraph, what I would like you to do is to send it to your English teacher using their email address. If, of course, you get a bit stuck along the way, then you can get in touch with them and ask for some help. That's absolutely fine. Of course, remember, you can also look back at my paragraph, at the sentence starters that I've given you, and see if they help too. Good luck with your writing. I'm sure you'll do a fabulous job. And make sure that you take care and stay safe. Thank you for listening. I hope it's been helpful.
Hopefully we'll get to see you very soon. Take care of yourselves.